Mike, you have to unmute.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. According to my watch, it's almost 10, so we will get going without further delay. Welcome to this very special online talk hosted by the Department of History of National Zhengzhi University, or otherwise known as NCCU. Allow me to say a few words that originally we were hoping to invite every one of you to our very cozy, comfortable conference room at the Department of History in person. However, due to the recent change of situation, you know what I mean, in Taiwan, we have to move this online. But I think this actually gives us an opportunity to open this very special talk to people, not just on NCCU campus, but also beyond. I already see a couple names that I know who I believe is either in Japan or the US or further beyond. So welcome everyone from Taiwan and from afar. Before I introduce you to the speaker, you all know the speaker today, who is the well-known historian, Professor Azuma Eijiro from University of Pennsylvania. But before I introduce him further, I would like to invite the chair of the Department of History, Professor Chen Xiufen, to say a few words. Professor Chen, please.
Okay, thank Mike. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. It's my pleasure to say something here for Professor Azuma's talk. Azuma Sensei is affiliated with the Department of History, University of Pennsylvania. Owing to Professor Mike Lang's recommendation, we have invited him to be a visiting professor at the department, thanks to the generous sponsorship of Kejibu. Currently, Professor Azuma is teaching two courses for the students, one for undergraduate and the other for the postgraduate student. I'm really sorry that we cannot gather together in the conference meeting room at the department. But I hope that this talk, even though to be held in virtual form, will be successful. And thank to Professor Azuma again. And thank you for bringing us so fruitful teaching and researching result and sharing it with us. And I'm really sorry that in this morning I have 3 conferences and a meeting. So I should not stay long in the conference room. I'm sorry about it. But as we are recording the whole talk, so maybe I will return to the video later. And thank you and good luck. Let's see.
Thank you, Professor Chen, for taking time off from your very busy schedule. And for some reason that since we are moving everything online virtually, everybody seems to be even more busy than what we are before. I would, as Professor Chen mentioned, that this year, Professor Azuma has been visiting this department starting from March, I believe. And the original plan is that he would stay until the end of June. And of course, we are hoping to do various activities in person throughout these 4 months. However, on the one hand, time flies. And on the other hand, we didn't really expect something like this happen. However, I think we would still take the most of his will still make the most out of his stay here in Taiwan. And I'm sure that many students at NCCU already had the pleasure and privilege to take classes with him. I actually sit in the class a couple of times, and I can feel that Professor Azuma really bring a new, fresh perspective to our students today. And I think this is what we are hoping to do through the talk today. Professor Azuma, as Professor Chen introduced, is professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Pennsylvania from the US. And I have to bring this out. This is the book. Oh, so for some reason it's reverse, but you can read the title. This is his masterpiece, published in 2020, and has been awarded the Fairbank Prize by American Historical Association. And I believe Professor Azuma's talk would draw some major points from his book today. And of course, I hope Professor Azuma would expand further on a few key points that he very nicely elaborated in his work. So without further ado, I will move the floor to Professor Azuma.
Thank you, Professor Lan Ciji. And also I'd like to start with many thanks to the Department of History at National Jiangxi University, and especially at the professor and chair, Chen Shifeng. And thanks for taking time off your busy meetings and show up and gave me a good introduction. And also I'd like to thank the staff and then other faculty members at the history department, NCCU. And there are some students of mine actually in the audience. Thank you for taking time to attend my, talk. And some of our graduate students, I forced them to attend, so they had to be here. And I see that there's some old friends from outside the NCCU, and then some from Japan and US too. Thank you for taking time to be here, and especially in the early morning. It's probably tough for some, I know, but thank you. It's really great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to share my research with you. But before that, I have to actually tell you one thing. I'm having that technological problem. My MacBook is having a power problem, and I still have 83% of battery left, but it's not charging, and my power adapter is not really working. So I will go as long as I can on this way with my computer, but I might actually be cut off if the computer runs off the power. Then I will switch to iPhone. I'm already connected to my iPhone here. So there might be some confusions or some, I might disappear for a while, but then I will be back. So I just wanted to let you know that, and sorry about that. So thank you again. So let me then, without further ado, let me start with what I'm supposed to do today. So my talk today, let me, before that, I should probably share the PowerPoint slide without continue to show my face. You probably are tired of seeing my face anyway. So yeah, here, this is my talk. Now, so my talk today unveils the intertwining strains of Japanese settler colonialism in Hawaii and Taiwan, which gave rise to the plantation-style production and industrial canning of pineapple in Imperial Japan. This unknown story forms a poignant example of what I call inter-imperial exchange and learning between the colonial tropics of the American and Japanese empires. I use pineapple as a way to illuminate complex entanglements of US and Japanese tropical colonialisms, with the focus on the indispensable role of Hawaii's Japanese immigrants who facilitated the transfer of knowledge and technique of modern pineapple farming and canning by remigrating from US-controlled Hawaii to Japanese-ruled Taiwan. Before getting into the main theme, however, I would like to offer a larger context of my study of Taiwan's pineapple industry and its connections to Hawaii. Let me move to the second slide. Here. All right, so yeah, as Professor Lan already kindly showed you, this is my book, and I have a table of content here. So today's talk draws from the chapter 6 of my recent book titled In Search of Our Empire, Japanese America, and etc. Colonialism in the Construction of Japan's Borderless Empire. Incidentally, it is now being translated into Chinese, and the Chinese version should be available next year. My editor, publisher, Ms. Lotus Chan is here, so thank you for being here. Hopefully you'll be able to read this in Chinese soon. Now, having made the self-serving announcement, now I would like to explain major aspects of my book, especially its goals and significance. Now, moving to the slide 3, I believe that some of you have access to the handouts I produced on this, so you might want to refer to that. If not, you can just read this part. So I will talk about this. So if you have, first, my book looks into the ways in which the historical example of American-style frontier development inspired many Japanese people to engage in overseas migration and agricultural colonization inside and outside Japan's former empire for the cause of national expansion under the slogan of overseas development. This is a Japanese word, but you should understand what it means in Chinese. 海外発展. Second, my study also traces origins of the Japanese discourse on overseas development, 海外発展論, the second point, and then trace the origins of that discourse to the first modern era settlements of Japanese immigrants in North America, especially Northern California and Hawaii. Starting the late 1880s, these immigrants, the first generation Japanese Americans, took the lead in discursive formation on imperial Japanese destiny for overseas expansion and settlement, even before Japan acquired its external colonies, including Taiwan. In this sense, during the last decade of 19th century, 1890s, late 1880s and 1890s, Japanese immigrant communities of San Francisco and Hawaii, or Honolulu, emerged as major sites of expansionist and colonialist knowledge production for Japan, which worked transnationally with the simultaneous political and ideological developments among intellectuals, social elites, business leaders, and government officials in Tokyo. Because these US-based immigrants had the first-hand experience as settler colonists in the world's most famous New World frontier, particularly California, they exerted an enormous influence on the shaping of Imperial Japan's colonial thinking and practices that would soon unfold in its former colonial territories like Taiwan and Manchuria. Next, my book has 2 chapters that look at the translocal connections between North America's Japanese settlements and Japan's former colonies, namely California-Manchuria connections, that's chapter 5 of my book, and Hawaii-Taiwan connections, chapter 6, which I will talk about later. Here, moving to this. Okay. All right. Now, between these locations, there were waves of reverse migration, specifically those Japanese who moved back from white-dominated North America to their own racial empire of Japan. These re-migrants were often recruited by Japan's colonial regimes and colonial monopoly capital to help develop Japan's new frontiers with their experience as settler colonists in the US frontier. Their experience-based expertise in land development and agricultural colonization was particularly valued and desired by Japan's colonial regime and industries when they encountered unfamiliar terrains, geographic terrains, and then climates, environments, and farm conditions. The management of local multi-ethnic labor force also was part of the technical expertise that these remigrants from North America were expected to offer to Japan's colonial regime. Because US-based immigrants developed an intense disdain for racial exclusion by white Americans, they emphasized the opposite as desirable behavior of master colonial race. What are those? Benevolent assimilation and pan-Asianism toward Japan's colonized subject instead of outright racial exclusion. In my book, I employ a set of a new analytical concept and interpretive frames, which I detail on the PowerPoint slide here. Now, this one. Let me summarize them quickly. First, I introduced the concept of settler colonialism, the first part, into the study of empire, colonialism, and migration. Having been popularized in Anglophone academia, including the United States, this concept allows us to problematize and complicate the entwined processes of colonial economic changes, cultural and social assimilation, and reforms, so often under the banner of civilization and modernization, like Bunmeikan Kindaika, that displacement and exploitation and oppression and genocide even, from the standpoint of natives, that is, the colonized peoples whose land was robbed by immigrants or colonizers, whose cultures were decimated and replaced by colonizers, and whose lifestyles completely altered in the context of immigrant settlement making, development, and civilization building and modernization. The concept of settler colonialism is particularly useful when we tackle the question of the various effects that the migration, colonization, and development had on the colonized populations, as well as the different positionalities among them in the hierarchical power structure of colonial rule. However, because settler colonialism as a theoretical framework has its roots in Anglophone, Eurocentric historical case studies and examples, its application to the Japanese imperial context requires critical perspectives and careful theoretical adjustments. My book shows the utility and limitations of settler colonialism as an interpretive frame and a historical method in the study of Japanese migration-led colonialism and its impacts on Japan's former territories and extraterritorial foreign immigrant settlements outside the empire, like Japanese America or Japanese Brazil. Beyond the boundaries of sovereign political control, imperial Japanese and overseas Japanese residents often saw their home empire and external racial settlements being inseparable and integral to Japan's global borderless empire, therefore the title of my book. Settler colonialism as an interpretive lens or frame would be useful for uncovering these connections that are usually obscured by scholars' focus on state sovereignty and national borders, but at the same time, state power and national borders still provided a background for the different experience that overseas immigrants and colonial settlers would have in the different locations. My theoretical use of settler colonialism pays serious attention to these critical issues, differences and similarities and intersections, when looking into the relations between Japanese communities in the United States and various colonial settlements inside Japan's former territories, including Taiwan. Second, my book adopts what I call the inter-imperial and trans-imperial perspectives by looking at the movements of migrant bodies, ideas, and technologies of colonial development and governance between the two Pacific empires, the United States and Imperial Japan. Moving to this slide. Now, inter-imperial, trans-imperial here. By doing so, we can rescue the study of colonialism and migration from the conventional single empire perspective that looks only at the relations between the imperial metropole, in this case Japan, and its colonies, Taiwan, and so forth. Because Japanese imperialism did not emerge in a geographic vacuum detached from other parts of the world, it is important to have an inter- and trans-imperial perspective to understand how it was always entangled with what other imperialism did. At the same time, because local political economies in one empire were already diverse enough, like Korea and Manchuria or Taiwan are very different in many ways, right? And so then the inter- and trans-imperial perspective needs to be attentive to different local conditions. It means the specific manifestations of inter- and trans-imperial entanglements between the two empires tended to be place-specific, locally specific kind of manifestations. For example, colonial Taiwan's relationship to Hawaii became so salient and strong because Taiwan-Hawaii connections or nexus entailed overlapping or shared imperial aspirations for and trajectories of the tropical agricultural industries like sugar, coffee, and pineapple in the US Empire and Japanese Empire. These local connections were not randomly forged. Thus, we need to pay attention to the specific patterns of trans-local linkage formation. Now let me move to the discussion of Japanese immigrants in North America, some of whom would become re-migrants moving to Taiwan and other parts of Japan's colonial empire. Although they are not numerous in Japanese immigrant society in the United States, a significant number of the Trans-Pacific resettlers were self-styled or self-proclaimed frontier farmers who tended to view the development of agricultural land and natural resources, whether in the United States or in Imperial Japan, as being connected to what they called overseas Japanese development or expansion, 日本民族の海外発展. Thousands of these pioneers of national and racial expansion had migrated to and congregated in California and Hawaii from the mid-1880s through the 1910s because they considered those US Western territories to be the most authentic frontiers that awaited a civilized and expansive race like the Japanese. Having been inspired by the American popular discourse on frontier development, they had still maintained both psychic and material connections to the colonialist endeavors of their homeland or home empire. And for this reason, it was not far-fetched proposition for them to re-migrate from Hawaii to Taiwan if circumstances called for such a move, as I will discuss soon. For many US-based Japanese immigrants, there emerged particular historical conditions that made many people to consider returning to their home empire. First, between 1890s or 1892 and 1908, the first period here, and then between 1919 and 1924 or so. During these two periods, white exclusionist agitation in the United States or US West especially, and Hawaii led to the rise of institutionalized racism, many different laws against Japanese and the Japanese immigrants, propelling many to seek alternative frontiers to live as masters of their own destiny and development, not as an oppressed racial minority under the thumb of white men. I'd like to just make this, comment here, that this anti-Japanese agitation was a kind of extension of the earlier anti-Chinese agitation, which resulted in the exclusion of Chinese under 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Japanese actually entered into the labor market of Hawaii and then California and other parts of American West after Chinese were excluded. So, so then once the number of Japanese increased, then they became the target of racial exclusionism of white Americans, which basically adopted the same rhetoric against Oriental invasion. Because under Orientalism, Japanese, Chinese are the same thing in the white American eyes. Okay. Now, let's see. So then the power price shows that now I'm going to move on to the next PowerPoint slide. Now, this PowerPoint slide shows the list of some of the early Japanese immigrant leaders in San Francisco and Honolulu who moved to various parts of East and Southeast Asia, including Japan's former colonial territories. These people were all celebrated as driving forces of Imperial Japan's overseas expansion and founders of its formal and informal colonial settlement later in the Imperial Japan's kind of orthodoxy. Okay, so there are a bunch of people. This fourth guy, Otsuki Konosuke, this guy, he actually came to Hawaii. Came to Taiwan from Hawaii. Okay, via Canada. Okay. So now about this guy, just an example of these people, what they did and so forth, and the Taiwan connection. I'm going to just talk a little bit about this Otsuki guy. So he's actually celebrated in Taiwan context of Hualien as sort of an important kind of person for development of farmland in Hualien area. Okay, basically sugar plantations sort of a land. So there's a memorial near the campus of National Donghua University. It's still standing now. It's actually designated as a historical sort of a site by Hualien, local government, and so kind of preserved. Okay, show you that the inscription on this memorial in Chinese here. You should be able to read it. His name is here. Okay, mentioned, and then this is an English translation. So he's actually kind of, celebrated as that important figure in colonial development of Taiwan's eastern Taiwan's frontier. But he's in the context of Japanese American history, in the early phase of Japanese American history in Hawaii, he was actually a very important leader in the Japanese immigrant society in Hawaii. Okay, and the same kind of sort of idea was attached to his role as a community leader in Japanese Hawaii. Basically, he was kind of responsible for doing all kind of new things to develop the Japanese settlement, and which I list here. Anyway, so he's one of the many people who actually moved from North America to East Asia and Southeast Asia, and then later celebrated as kind of founders of Japanese colonial settlements in Japan or around Japan. Okay, and I'm planning to write a small book on this guy, and there are some other guys like him in the early phase of Taiwan's colonial development, especially agricultural development in eastern part and also the southern part of Taiwan. So I will come back to Taiwan again for more research, and then you'll probably see me wandering around. So anyway, so just wanted to mention about this guy as an example. Now, meanwhile, Japan's colonial regimes in Manchuria and Taiwan began their own efforts to bring some of the first generation Japanese Americans for agricultural development through their expertise in US-style large-scale scientific farming. Here, now the Japanese government or colonial regimes and monopoly capital are now interested in these people, what they could offer, okay, as sort of an expert of colonial agriculture and development, like this Otsuki guy. And Otsuki actually was invited by the local sugar monopoly company in Hualien, okay, and supported by the, of course, colonial regime. Anyway, so that's another example. For example, after the alien land laws deprived Japanese immigrants of farming rights in California, in the 1924 US Immigration Act terminated further Japanese immigration, the examples of institutionalized racism against Japanese, especially farmers, right, and California especially. South Manchuria Railway decided to invite a group of Japanese immigrant rice farmers from California to promote so-called machine agriculture, large-scale machine agriculture, with tractors and mechanical farm equipment imported from the United States. This is these are the pictures of the this kind of rice farming done by this guy from California who was once known as a rice king because he was so successful. Before that, the Indian land law made it difficult for him to continue to farm. But he was invited, and then basically invited the South Manchuria Railway, and then brought all the equipment, and then his, some of his associate and family members as well, along with the technical knowledge and expertise to do this kind of rice farming, which was unknown to most Japanese at that time. Japan's a small place, and then most Japanese rice farmers never really used the tractors back then. But the Manchuria is a large place like California, and then you can't just rely on the human power, right? Therefore, you need the machines. Well, who could do this kind of work? Well, you have already Japanese farmers in California who had been experienced in these things and so forth, right? So yeah, that makes sense, right? So this is one example of California-Hawaii connection. In Japanese-controlled Taiwan, similar attempts to recruit Hawaii-based immigrants and returnees existed since the early 1900s, even before that is 1920s and so forth. Soon after Taiwan's colonial regime adopted the modernization of sugar industry as its major economic policy mandate, the government general of Taiwan Soto Crew, recruited former Hawaii residents as specialists in modern sugarcane cultivation and sugar mill work because the authorities valued and wanted to learn from their experience in Hawaii's sugar industry. Okay, so this is a news item I found in the Taiwan Nichinichi Shinpo, published in Taipei in 1907, about the recruitment of former Hawaii residents experienced in the sugar mill work and also the sugar cane cultivation. Okay, this was done by the government general, especially Tomkyoku Sugar Industry Bureau, I guess. Okay, of the Soto Crew. Okay, so that's one. That's not as early as 1907, and then there actually a bunch of people recruited and they came to Taiwan to work in the nascent, sort of emerging modern Taiwan sugar industry. Okay. Now more about the Taiwan, the sugar connection, I guess. Taiwan's biggest sugar company, Taiwan Seto Kabushiki Kaisha, also had the strong connections to the history of Japanese migration to Hawaii. Established in 1900 with a capital infusion from Zaibatsu Mitsui, the founders and chief managers of Taiwan Seto Kabushiki Kaisha, or Taiwan Seto Company, sugar production company, included the same core group of individuals who had taken charge of the Japanese government-sponsored immigration scheme by which to recruit and transport thousands of thousands of rural Japanese farmers for Hawaii's sugar plantation work between 1885 and 1894. This massive immigration of ordinary Japanese into Hawaii marked the very beginning of the entire migration history of modern Japan. So these Hawaii immigrants are the first group of Japanese who actually went all over went outside of Japan, okay, as immigrants. So, and then of course that's 1885, 1894. That's before that the Japan even had the overseas territory, right? So that's before that colonial time. Now, so in 1885, the guy named Takechi Tadamichi, or Naomichi, sometimes known as Naomichi. This is a Chinese character, his name. He would be later the founders of Taiwan Seto, Taiwan Sugar Production Company, the biggest sugar monopoly in colonial Taiwan. He actually, 1885, moved to Honolulu with the first group of government-sponsored immigrant workers as a Mitsui representative. So he was actually part of this government-sponsored migration recruitment scheme, and he was actually the first one who went to Honolulu with the workers, but he was not the worker. Okay, he was kind of supervisor, sent by Mitsui, basically. Not only was Takechi the first Japanese to then graduate from Oahu College, now it's known as Punahou School, the elitist sort of a kind of school in Hawaii. President Obama actually graduated from Punahou as well. But Takechi actually attended the Punahou Oahu College back then, only a few years after Sun Yat-sen attended the same school, as you might know. But Takechi also became widely recognized in Japan's elite circles as a rare expert on the sugar business, as an expertise that the few Japanese shared when the Japanese Empire acquired its first tropical colony of Taiwan, suitable for large-scale sugar production. So in 1900, after returning from Honolulu, Takechi joined forces with the same Mitsui executives who had worked together in the earlier government-sponsored immigration scheme to establish the Taiwan Seito Company, or Taiwan Sugar Production Company. As colonial monopoly capital, Mitsui anticipated Japanese-ruled Taiwan's main industry would become sugar, just like the US-controlled tropical colony of Hawaii. So then, who would be the best person to actually, give kind of sort of expertise on this sugar industry? Takechi. He had lived in Honolulu. He had graduated from the elite Oahu College. He knew, a lot about how the sugar industry worked. Right? He was not just a worker. He was not actually a worker, but he actually had a connection to the sugar industry heads, white people in Honolulu and so forth. So he knew a lot about the management side of the sugar industry. Okay, what's done in Hawaii and so forth. So he became part of these founding members of the Taiwan Seito, funded by Mitsui money. Okay. And under Takechi's influence, the Taiwan Seito built a number of modern sugar mills, modeled after those in Hawaii with imported equipment from there, while recruiting dozens of Hawaii's experienced Japanese immigrants as sugarcane mill engineers and farming experts. Later, as Taiwan Seito's president, Takechi reigned over Taiwan's largest sugar interest and hence held a domineering power over the entire sugar industry in colonial Taiwan. And then there is even the Chinese language biography of his. This was actually published in 2005. So, and he's kind of celebrated now in Taiwan as, I guess, the pioneer of modern sugar industry. Okay. Anyway, but he had a Hawaii connection. The history of Taiwan's modern pineapple industry also began with notable infusions from Japanese immigrants in Hawaii, as well as those who had strong Hawaii connections under the general government policy to promote modernization and rationalization based on Hawaii's examples. Starting around 1923, the government general of Taiwan, Taiwan Sotoku, made concerted efforts for crop diversification and strove to build an infrastructure for rationalized industrial agriculture, modeled most notably after the US tropical colony of Hawaii. Pineapple was among the several new crops that colonial rulers endeavored to promote in addition to sugar. This turn of events in Taiwan coincided with the second rise of anti-Japanese agitation in the United States between the late 1910s and the early 1920s, as I mentioned. Thus, the historical developments on both sides of the Pacific, exclusionist racism in the United States on the one hand, and Imperial Japan's attempt to recruit US Japanese residents for its colonial project on the other, these two developments on the both sides of the Pacific paved the way to the influx into Taiwan of Japanese pineapple exports from Hawaii, who went on to serve as teachers and facilitators of US-modeled colonial farming and industry for the home empire, especially after the mid-1920s. It was in this context that modern pineapple industry emerged in southern Taiwan with the support of Japan's colonial regime and monopoly capital. move on to the next. This is kind of timeline, so you can just kind of go over this while I talk. There are two types of Japanese re-migrants from Hawaii to Taiwan. First, experienced growers of the Hawaiian variety of smooth cayenne pineapple, and those with experience in the mechanized canning process of smooth cayenne crop. Because Hawaii had taken the lead in technological development in both farming and canning side of the business, it is precisely in these areas where experienced Japanese re-migrants from America's tropical colony could find unique opportunities and command authority vis-a-vis native Taiwanese growers and settler farmers from Japan under the support of Taiwan's colonial administrators and capitalists. Now, smooth cayenne is written in Chinese this way. Okay, that's came from Hawaii, and it's still the mainstay of Taiwan's pineapple industry. Okay. Let's see. Where was I? The first successful attempt to grow the smooth cayenne variety from Hawaii in Taiwan involved the man that I discussed already, Otsuki Konosuke of Hualien. He actually brought this smooth cayenne with him to try out how it worked in Taiwan. And then he sort of Otsuki experimented the cultivation of the new pineapple variety from Hawaii in 1911. And his success impressed the real potential of smooth cayenne cultivation upon the government, agricultural engineers, and local farm leaders. But there was also an attempt by a Japanese settler with Singapore ties, Southeast Asian connection instead of Hawaii connection. And this guy actually, this settler, Japanese settler, wanted to challenge the increasing official interest in Hawaii's smooth cayenne by introducing a Southeast Asian variety of Sarawak pineapple plants into Taiwan. That would be the rival pineapple plant from Southeast Asia, especially Singapore or Malay Peninsula. Okay. This situation induced the Central Agricultural Research Center of the colonial regime to carry out a comprehensive study on the suitability of various foreign pineapple varieties for canning purpose, resulting finally in the formal adoption of Hawaii's smooth cayenne as the officially endorsed pineapple variety in 1924. So here. So then the smooth cayenne kind of won this sort of a kind of battle, basically, with the Southeast Asian variety. And all the people who supported the Southeast Asian variety with their tie to Singapore and then Southeast Asia. 1 year after, in 1925, 1 year after 1924, in 1925, the arrival of long-time Oahu residents named Okazaki Nihei, this is Okazaki Nihei in Chinese character, and followed by many others like him, 1925, signaled the beginning of what can be termed Hawaiianization or Hawaii-ka in Taiwan's pineapple economy. Taiwan's new pineapple industry formed an important historical site where state-endorsed effort at industrial development consciously appropriated or co-opted the immigrant desire to seek an independent life and freedom from white American racism in Hawaii. 1 year after the passage of the US 1924 Immigration Act, excluding all the Japanese, Okazaki Nihei gave up on Hawaii. He said basically, hell with this racist Hawaii, right? And took an offer from Japanese capitalists to help build and manage the day-to-day operations of the first Hawaii-style pineapple farm cannery complex in Pingtung. Under the Taiwan Pineapple Cultivation Company, this is the name in Chinese character, Okazaki served as the first manager of the Laopi plantation set up by this company. That's in rural Pingtung, and took the lead in the establishment of its modern cannery equipped with the latest machinery from Hawaii. Oops, sorry. After 2 years of preparation, Okazaki's new venture in Laopi facilitated the spread of Hawaii-style pineapple farming in Kaohsiung, Pingtung region. Next. Okay, going here. Land cultivated for Hawaii-originated smooth cayenne doubled in just 1 year between 1929 and 1930, the time when the planting of pineapple saplings became intensified on Okazaki's Laopi plantation after massive land clearing. Initially, the land was kind of like a jungle, so you had to actually clear the land. It took a long time. But once it's done, then smooth cayenne was planted. Before World War II, the first mechanized modern cannery to which Okazaki was connected, and the 3 newer canning facilities that followed it, packed only the Hawaii varieties, smooth cayenne, that were harvested on company-owned plantations in order to produce top-grade canned products for export. Behind the rise of the mechanized canning business that relied on smooth cayenne lay not only a new economic policy of colonial Taiwan, but also associated investment from Tokyo industrialists, especially the person named Takasaki Tatsunosuke of Toyo Can Manufacturing Company, which was Japan's leading tin can manufacturer. It is still the leading tin can manufacturer in Japan. Back then it was too. Yeah, Toyo Seikan Kabushiki, that's how it's written in Chinese character. As mentioned, Okazaki's remigration from Hawaii to Taiwan was linked with the colonial regime's attempt to modernize Taiwan's pineapple industry in order that Taiwan not only had the strong export-oriented colonial economy, but also could compete head-on with its Hawaiian, that's American, and Singaporean, British rivals, the top 2 exporters of canned pineapples at that time in the global consumer market. So that was the intention of that Taiwan Sotoku colonial regime to promote pineapple for export purpose, for canned pineapple, okay? Not the fresh pineapple to eat in Taiwan or Japan, okay? Backed by the new agro-industrial policy of Imperial Japan, Takasaki Tatsunosuke, head of the Toyo can manufacturing company, wanted to set up a large-scale pineapple plantation and introduce rationalized cultivation and canning processes into Taiwan. A firm believer in modern scientific farming, Okazaki, coming from Hawaii, held similar views as those of Takasaki, his financial sponsor. The triangular partnership among former Hawaii residents like Okazaki, Tokyo capitalists like Takasaki, and the colonial regime constituted the backbone of Taiwan's challenge to its US and British rivals in the global pineapple or canned pineapple trade. And that challenge was predicated upon the systematic transplantation of Hawaii-style farming and canning through Transpacific Japanese remigration catalyzed by US settler racism. In this context, Okazaki and his Hawaii associates assumed a specific identity as the teachers for Taiwan's pineapple growers and cannery operators. Having immigrated to Hawaii in 1907, that's when Okazaki moved to Hawaii, Okazaki had firmly embraced the settler colonist idea of overseas development, or kaigai hatten, and consciously aspired to emulate the example of America's legendary Puritan pioneers to promote Japan's national expansion. Not content with working as sugarcane field worker under the dictate of white American plantation owners, Okazaki looked to pineapple farming as a way to pursue economic independence and Japanese racial prosperity in white-dominated Hawaii. Only a decade after James Dole, the founder of Dole Corporation, had organized his company, Dole Corporation, to operate Hawaii's first pineapple plantation cannery complex, only 10 years after that, Okazaki's choice of the crop not only demonstrated his naive expansionism mixed with strong racial nationalism, but it also followed the general pattern of appropriation of white American colonial practices by many self-styled Japanese immigrant frontiersmen like him in Hawaii or in California. By the late 1910s, Okazaki had been already widely known as one of Hawaii's most important Japanese authorities on the pineapple, especially smooth cayenne pineapple. When officials and agricultural technocrats from colonial Taiwan visited Hawaii on inspection tours, they paid visit to Okazaki to get the latest information on the smooth cayenne pineapple. And it was on these occasions that this Hawaii immigrant learned about the opportunities for pineapple enterprise in Taiwan. Okazaki's interest in Taiwan intensified when Takasaki Tatsunosuke visited Honolulu to observe Hawaii's pineapple canning industry in 1924. Okay. With the help of Japanese industrialists, Takasaki had played a central role in the establishment of Toyo Can Manufacturing Company, Toyo Seikan Kabushiki Gaisha, in Japan in 1917. As the government general of Taiwan adopted its pro-modernization policy in the early 1920s, as I mentioned, Takasaki entertained the idea of combining can manufacturing with the harvest of content materials, pineapple, in order to dominate the business process and maximize profitability. In 1922, Takasaki put that idea into practice by founding or establishing Taiwan's first and only tin can factory in central Kaohsiung, followed by the establishment of the Laopi pineapple plantation, for which Okazaki was to be recruited from Hawaii. The trajectories of these two individuals, Takasaki and Okazaki, crossed during the Takasaki's investigative trip in Hawaii, Takasaki's investigative trip to Hawaii in 1924. In order to obtain a good understanding of how Hawaii's modern pineapple industry worked and to prepare for his ambitious Taiwan project, Takasaki looked to Okazaki's expertise and hired him as an advisor and guide to Hawaii's plantation or pineapple industry. After this first-hand observation, Takasaki then invited Okazaki to Taiwan to assess the suitability of large-scale smooth cayenne cultivation and mechanized canning in Taiwan. Moving to the slides. Here, okay, there's a news reports on that. Laopi is written in Chinese in this way. Okazaki's 3-month tour through rural Taiwan subsequently generated a positive report, which positively compared, of course, or favorably compared the southern Taiwan soil and climate and environment to its Hawaiian counterparts. Produced by Hawaii's foremost Japanese expert on the pineapple, the assessment was precisely what Takasaki had desired since the building of his tin can factory in Kaohsiung in 1922. Subsidized by Toyo Can Manufacturing Company, Taiwan Pineapple Cultivation Company was established in 1925, as I already mentioned, and it ran a plantation-style pineapple estate in Laopi, not far from Takasaki's tin can factory and its affiliated canneries in the greater Kaohsiung region. Back here, so that's, Although the plantation site was initially almost completely untouched, the massive property was projected to become the biggest pineapple farm in Japan's tropical colony, and Okazaki was asked to serve as general manager. So here, this is the newspaper here, information here. Apparently, Okazaki assembled a team of former Hawaii residents as his full-time aides. So a lot more Hawaii folks came with him and then following him. A Japanese visitor described in early 1929, quote, "Everything was done in a Hawaiian way because leading staff at the Laupi plantation had gained their knowledge and skills from years of experience in Hawaii," end quote. This visitor's observation suggested that Okazaki's example inspired other Hawaii residents to seek employment as pineapple export elsewhere in Taiwan, as a few more plantation-style farms were established after the late 1920s, often with zaibatsu financial backing, like Mitsubishi. Indeed, Nakao Magoichi, Okazaki's old friend, separately moved from Kaneohe in Oahu to Kaohsiung to assume a manager role at the Fenshan Pineapple Plantation, another subsidiary of Takasaki's group company. This is him much older later, but when he visited Hawaii in the late 1930s with actually the agricultural engineer or the scientist actually educated at the National Imperial Taipei Imperial University, and he would become the very important figure in as an agricultural engineer attached to the Sotoku. I think they actually came to Hawaii in the late 1930s to kind of spy on the Hawaii's pineapple industry, even though it was built as a private visit. But anyway, this was published in the Nippujiji, Honolulu Japanese newspaper, okay, about this Nakao here. He was Okazaki's friend, okay, but he was also the director of the large-scale Fenshan pineapple plantation near Kaohsiung. In the same decade, Takasaki's rival industrialist in Taiwan also brought over another Hawaii immigrant named Nagai Toshio to oversee the plantation or operation of a new pineapple cannery in the outskirts of Kaohsiung, Jochutan. Nagai was said to have had more than a dozen years of experience in pineapple cannery work in Oahu, along with the 10 years experience as a pineapple farmer there. Other groups of Hawaii Japanese also moved to seek better opportunities in Japan's tropical frontier when white-dominated Hawaii came to look more and more incompatible to their etc. colonial expectations. Another example is a newspaper article published in, again, Nippujiji, Honolulu Japanese newspaper, about a bunch of the Maui Japanese pineapple farmers going to the Taiwan to kind of observe, but also that they actually later got the government land to develop the Hawaii-style pineapple kind of farm as well. Okay, there are many others like that. Now, not only did Okazaki's example help bring human resources from Hawaii's Japanese immigrant community, but he also introduced the latest US machinery and Hawaii-style scientific operations to Taiwan's pineapple fields and canning factories. Here, this is actually the pictures of his Laupi farm. See, this is a large-scale operation. They even have a sort of small kind of railroad system inside. And this is, I think, Okazaki. And then these are, I think, Taiwanese workers. But, you see that this is kind of plantation operation, okay? Now, based on his previous experience, Okazaki utilized US-made tractors and other mechanical equipment. Okazaki was also responsible for the technical aspect of the organization of Taiwan's first modern cannery near the Laupi plantation in 1928. For this project, Okazaki was dispatched to Honolulu to negotiate the purchase of the most advanced machinery, canning machinery, including the Jinaka automated peeling and slicing machine, one of the Hawaii inventions and revolutionary changes that James Stoll's pineapple empire brought to the industry. Here's the pictures of the modern canning factories equipped with the U.S.-made or Hawaii-made machines. This is established near Kaohsiung or Laupi plantation as well. Okay. Now this is a Jinaka automated peeling and slicing machine. You see that there are like only few workers working here, right? This machine basically peel off the skin of pineapple automatically and cut off the top and also the bottom of the pineapple, and even slicing the pineapple into the right size or appropriate size for can. Okay, it's all done by basically machine. You just need a few people to actually check on that how the machine works and so forth. Before this, it's all done by human hands. That means that you needed to have like a bunch of workers, a lot of workers with knife in hand, each person working on the pineapple, peeling the sort of a skin and then cut off the top and bottom and then slicing that pineapple into kind of right size, right, for the can, right? And so so you need a lot of people, labor cost, and it's much slower than the machine, and so forth, right? So this was revolutionary change. Now, because of Okazaki's connection, this machine was imported into the Taiwan, and and this was very important part of the success of Taiwan's modern canning industry. Okay. Now, Okazaki and his associate also practiced, if not directly transplanted, Hawaii-style labor management of ethnic division and control as well, by employing heterogeneous groups of workers consisting of local Taiwanese men and women and Paiwan Aborigines, or indigenous Paiwan people, under the control of Japanese experts, mainly with Hawaii background. Now I'm talking about the labor management kind of sort of practice that these Hawaii folks also brought to the Taiwan's pineapple industry. Okay. Indeed, the potential for exploiting cheap indigenous labor, Yenjumin labor, Paiwan labor, had constituted a core of Okazaki's original recommendations for Laopi plantation site from the beginning, because the site was situated adjacent or next to the villages of Paiwan Aboriginal tribes, an abundant source of cheap and exploitable labor in Okazaki's eyes. Okazaki and other farm directors from Hawaii justified the low wages paid to and exploitation of the indigenous workforce with commonly held idea of their inferiority. This racist system of labor management resembled what had surrounded Hawaii's Japanese immigrants in the white-controlled plantation economy, sugar and pineapple economy that controlled the multiracial workforces in accordance with the mixture of racist discipline and paternalistic assimilationism under the control of white plantation owners. That's how that labor was managed in Hawaii. And then Okazaki kind of brought that over to Taiwan. For example, Okazaki's Japanese associate on Laopi pineapple farm, another resettler from Oahu, disparaged the Paiwan workers as ineffectual savages or dojin. But his paternalistic racism also led him to predict that the natives could improve after gaining experience under benevolent Japanese guidance. Nakao Magoichi, Okazaki's friend and director of a Fenshan pineapple plantation, also had this to say about the Aboriginal workers, the Yenjumin workers. Quote, "They are generally very simple-minded, and if guided properly, they would be a docile bunch. In terms of labor, they are largely useful for unskilled work only. So we put them to work for miscellaneous tasks like reclamation and land clearing." Here, this picture actually is taken by on the Laopi plantation, actual picture of Paiwan workers. So they actually did the back-breaking work of clearing the land, basically, right? You see here. This is of course, the commercial postcard. You can actually, I think this has actually taken, this picture was, these pictures actually taken almost the same area, actually. And then some of these workers actually here too, right? But then this commercial postcard, of course, is a kind of ideological piece with a lot of ideological message. It's kind of juxtaposition of symbol of civilization, the Japanese brought, I guess, right? Pineapple, kind of modern pineapple plantation, and then of course these dojin or savages with these savage clothing, right? So this is a typical colonial thing that you see that the juxtaposition of civilization and savagery, right? But anyway, but this is but the exploitation of indigenous labor was part of Okazaki's original plan, and also the continuous practice on his Laopi plantation. Okay, now under the Hawaii-style labor management that featured ethnic division and discrimination, this racist thinking explained why Taiwanese male workers mainly handled the more complicated work of planting pineapples, and Taiwanese female workers engaged in weeding and various miscellaneous tasks alongside the male workers. Even though women are paid much less than men, these Taiwanese workers are still, they still received much higher wages than Taiwan workers, who were actually subjected to the physically demanding labor deemed suitable for savages, as I mentioned. Both Taiwanese and Taiwan workers are worked separately. They worked separately from each other, even though both groups were placed under the control of Japanese experts and staff workers. It is not difficult to imagine that this system had the effect of alleviating whatever the discontent or dissatisfaction that Taiwanese workers might have held about their own inferior status in the colonial system, because colonized Taiwanese knew that there were always indigenous people below them. The idea that probably resonated with the pre-existing ethnocentrism of their own. It is important to note that this Hawaii-style labor management also of ethnic division and ethnic sort of a kind of discrimination, right? Almost harmonized neatly with the colonial regime's overall effort to civilize Taiwanese aborigines, or Riban Seisaku, that is to make them productive and functional in the overall economy of Japan's settler colonial empire. As a part of its civilizationist enterprise of pacification and uplift, Taipei, Japan's colonial regime in Taipei, strove to get the aboriginal tribes to abandon the primitive lifestyle of hunter-gatherers. Instead, the colonial authorities induced them to embrace the commercial economy through officially established trading posts, to move down and settle in lower lands, and engage in wage labor and agricultural pursuits, especially rice farming, within the capitalistic economic system. In this context, Okazaki's method of exploiting indigenous people as wage workers drew keen attention of local Japanese authorities, impressing them so much that pineapple work was swiftly incorporated into the general policy mandate, Riban Seisaku, of assimilating aborigines into the colonial economy and society in the Kaohsiung-Pingtung region. Okazaki's ethnically divided labor management and the plantation-style farming based on it in rural Pingtung contrasted with other well-capitalized corporate operations that followed it, such as the Mitsubishi-owned pineapple plantation in Doryu region. Here, it's kind of misspelled here, but the Doryu region. That's Mitsubishi operation. And Takasaki's new plantation cannery complex in Chai, around here. Let's see. Mitsubishi and other latecomers in the modern pineapple industry in Taiwan tended to adopt a method of Taiwanese tenancy-based farming instead of attempting to incorporate indigenous wage labor. Put differently, The other plantations worked with the other plantations without the direct Hawaii immigrant influence contracted Taiwanese tenant farmers to cultivate the land and grow pineapple crops instead of employing a bunch of wage workers as field hands. With this salient difference, it is not unreasonable to describe Okazaki's Laopi plantation as an outright symbol of a transplanted Hawaii in colonial Taiwan's modern pineapple industry. In addition to the introduction of smooth cayenne pineapple crops and associated farming and canning methods, Hawaiianization, or Hawaii-ka, therefore included the method of labor management that operated according to the principles of ethnic division and hierarchical wage system. Fundamentally, Okazaki and his fellow Japanese re-migrants from Hawaii functioned as an indispensable cog in the industrial development program or machine of Taiwan's colonial regime and monopoly capitalist. Going back here. Spearheaded by these colonial monopoly interests after 1935, now talking about the last part here, 1935, the industry-wide consolidation of pineapple canneries and farms took place under the general guidance of the government general, Sotoku, which enabled Taiwan to threaten the dominant position of Hawaii in the global canned pineapple export market toward the late 1930s. And this ascent of Taiwan's modern pineapple industry would not have so easily and quickly been attainable and possible without the first-hand experience, real-life knowledge, and actual technologies that these former Hawaii residents brought from the US tropical colony of Hawaii. In return, these Japanese re-migrants also benefited enormously on a personal level, not only because they could live as autonomous frontiersmen unmolested by white settler racism, but also because they could enjoy the privilege and power of colonial masters in their own frontier, just like white Americans did in their western frontier, including Hawaii. Yet before ending my presentation, I would like to complicate this story of Trans-Pacific Japanese re-migration and settler colonialism a little more with a brief discussion of the consequences of their quest of racism-free life on the colonized peoples in Taiwan. Viewed from the standpoint of colonial power relations, the negative impacts of what I have described as Hawaiianization or Hawaii-ka in pineapple industry were felt most severely by Taiwanese businessmen and farmers, especially at the time of 1935 industry-wide consolidation, which was carried out under the control of the government general and colonial monopoly capital interest, including or especially Takasaki's syndicate. Before the mid-1930s, most of the small-scale cannery owners were local Taiwanese businessmen who became faced with the choice of participating in consolidation scheme for an unfair, discriminatory amount of monetary compensations, or the choice of refusing to do so for no compensation at all. And neither option spared the life of their cannery operations, and hence their post or status as an independent manager in the end, because their outdated, poorly mechanized facilities were bound to be phased out or eliminated under the monopoly's modernization plan backed by the colonial regime after consolidation. This rendered most victims of consolidation Taiwanese cannery owners. Furthermore, because the vast majority of independent Taiwanese farmers had engaged in the cultivation of the native pineapple varieties, not smooth cayenne. Native varieties are a little different. Okay? it was not meant not considered as good for canning purpose. That's why smooth cayenne was brought over. But many Taiwanese farmers still continue to grow the native sort of traditional pineapple crop. Okay, but this situation, the rise of unfamiliar smooth cayenne crops in an export-centered industry paved the way to the economic downfall of Taiwanese farmers, and even worse, their displacement. It is for this reason that Taiwanese nationalist critics specifically attacked Takasaki's capitalist syndicate, which actually took the lead in consolidation and also the spread of smooth cayenne kind, right? And these critics, Taiwanese nationalist critics, condemned that the Takasaki's hideous plot, quote, to gobble up small to medium-sized factories run by Taiwanese people and brought the entire pineapple canning industry under their control, end quote. Okazaki and other Japanese re-migrants from Hawaii were indispensable for the success of this capitalistic plot or capitalist plot, backed by the colonial political leaders. Their departure from the US colonial tropics, Hawaii, constituted a part of their response to white racism there, that is, their pursuit for colonization without white man's obstruction, as Okazaki once declared before Japanese colonial authorities. Yet their pursuit of racism-free settler colonialism in Taiwan made the former Hawaii residents chief facilitators of native Taiwanese displacement as a result of remigration, not to mention the exploitation of indigenous workers. This formed an ironic legacy of these re-migrants' response to America's racist exclusion, a response that transformed a racial minority in the white-dominated frontier of Hawaii into the overlords of colonized natives in Imperial Japan's frontier of Taiwan. By looking at the Hawaii-Taiwan colonial nexus between the two Pacific empires, I explained why and how some Japanese residents in Hawaii renewed their ties and commitment to their home empire's settler colonialism, especially after the rise of white racial exclusionism in the United States. My talk also explained the ways in which Japan's colonial regime and metropole capital co-opted and took advantage of immigrant visions and practices when Hawaii-based immigrants faced the choice between the reality of being an oppressed racial minority in white America and the promise and possibility of new life as a colonial master in their own racial empire, particularly Taiwan. The Transpacific movements of their bodies, knowledge, ideas resulted from the individual choices they made. But their decisions could not be divorced or separated from the concurrent developments of US racial exclusion and Imperial Japan's colonial domination, since the entanglements of local US race politics and Japan's colonial policy agendas made Taiwan exceptionally attractive in the eyes of many Japanese in Hawaii. The stories of frontier settlers and teachers of pineapple farming from Hawaii to Taiwan shed light on the unknown migration circuits that rendered Japan's former empire, in this case Taiwan, and its extraterritorial immigrant society in America, Hawaii's Japanese community, indispensable partners in the common goal of borderless overseas Japanese expansion modeled after the US precedents and practices. It is for this reason that the study of Japanese colonialism needs to be connected to the analysis of historical development and human mobility that took place outside the former territories of Japanese empire. With inter-imperial and trans-imperial perspectives, my book offers an attempt at such historical analysis combined with deep transnational archival research. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Azuma, for this very informative and very enlightening talk. I really appreciate the inter-imperial perspective and the translocal entanglement that you mentioned in your book. I think from someone who studied Taiwan's history, I think this really helped us to better put Taiwan's history in a larger transnational perspective. And I'm sure the audience will feel very much the same way as I do, that after hearing your talk today, when we look at pineapple in Taiwan or a can of pineapple, I think we will no longer see it just as a can of Taiwan pineapple. We probably would now we get to know the history and the very complicated history made by what you mentioned, human mobility, starting from 100 years ago. I think nowadays, from now on, when we look at pineapple in Taiwan, or when we eat pineapple, we will probably see that Hawaiian connection and also that inter-imperial connection behind it. We still have about 40 minutes left. I think this is great, because this is what I'm hoping to engage the audience, and by offering this opportunity to the audience to ask questions or make comments to Professor Azuma's presentation in general. And I would like to say that because we have such a diverse audience today, we'll be very happy to entertain your questions and comments in English, Chinese, or even Japanese. So now we can turn the floor to the audience, and we will open up for question and answer. So please feel free to, I think it probably will be good to raise your hand first by signaling to me, then I will be able to identify you in sequence. So anyone who would like to ask a question, I think before we go further, this is the opportunity that I really want to encourage colleagues and students at NCCU, because I think this will be the only talk we have with Professor Azuma during his visit. Of course, I'm hoping very soon we'll be able to invite Professor Azuma back to NCCU and Taiwan again. So please feel free to take this opportunity to raise your question or comments. I know in an occasion like this, usually most people are thinking, "Oh, I'll be the second one to raise this question, to raise a question." So allow me to abuse my privilege as the host of this talk. I would like to ask Professor Azuma, I don't know if you'll be able to, or if you already have this information. You mentioned the impact on local people. You talk about the Aborigine, and also you emphasize at the very end of your talk, you emphasize those Taiwanese businessmen and cannery owners who are running on a much probably smaller scale, and because of this Hawaiianization, they were kind of pushed out of business. Do you have information about what happened to them afterwards? I'm thinking, did they take their experiences or expertise to somewhere else or other industry? I think this, I don't know if this will help us to better push the idea of this translocal or inter-imperial framework further.
Great, thank you for a wonderful question. I think you probably know some of the answers. That's why maybe you asked, but or if not, then that's very perceptive and great question. There's an interesting kind of side story attached to this. There's some studies already done on this, but group of Taiwanese cannery owners who lost their standing as such in the area near inland, that's for the central, the Taichung area. That's where there are many small-scale Taiwanese operated canneries existed. Okay, as opposed to that like a big monopoly capital operation, and those people are hard hit by the consolidation and so forth. Some survived, but the many actually kind of converted to other things. I didn't follow the footsteps of that many people, but then I had an impression that some people actually started to produce like a different kind of canned goods, which didn't really require high standard or kind of standardization or rationalization, so to speak, because the other kind of canned goods are actually meant for local consumption. So then, less mechanized facilities could still accommodate and then deal with that kind of stuff, right? So then instead of pineapple meant for export, then some of the small scale canning factory owners actually converted to something else, but continue to do that canning thing. But the interesting thing is a group of these former pineapple cannery owners decided to move to Ishigakijima, which is actually not too far from their standpoint. It's like a island next to, right? But now it's kind of divided by national border between the Republic of China and Japan. So it's a foreign country, but then the distance-wise and also kind of culturally speaking too, it's not like a foreign place. But then it's like the imagination, it's not a far away place. But but then to those people who decided to move there, Ishigakijima was their frontier, in my opinion. Okay, and then of course, these people are actually not your typical sort of working class Taiwanese. They're actually middle class Taiwanese with money. They had the money to operate their own businesses, right? And then most of them, that I look into the background of those people who went to Ishigakijima to start their own, pineapple farm and cannery. That was the purpose, actually. They actually were educated, okay? And so they're kind of sort of elite Taiwanese, colonized, but then sort of elite, not elite, but then kind of upper middle class sort of a segment of Taiwanese who were educated, coming from the urban area with a business background and with money too, right? And then those people went to Ishigakijima, which was to them a kind of frontier. The people in Ishigakijima are actually sort of beneath them in their standpoint, I think, in their perspective, right? And they acted as such. Therefore, there was a clash between the local Ishigakijima farmers and then these sort of Taiwanese settlers, I suppose. And then in the end, the Taiwanese settlers adopted the language of imperial subject, and then saying that, hey, we are all imperial subject and dedicated to the prosperity of our empire. So let's work together, right? And then that kind of sort of alleviated this tension that boiled up, or sort of kind of between the local native, I guess, Ishigakijima farmers and then these sort of Taiwanese settler farmers, right? Anyway, but of course, in the end, that the local people actually could get the support from Japan, because they are Japanese Ishigakijima people, right? And as opposed to Taiwanese who are colonized subjects. So that's a sort of a harsh reality for them. But anyway, the point here is, I guess that I think this settler colonialism idea is also possible to be used in this concept. I mean, I characterize these, Taiwanese immigrants to Ishigakijima as settlers, right? And I kind of try to explain that their relationship to local native Ishigakijima farmers in the language of sort of settler colonialism and so forth. Now, as I mentioned, there are some studies on these people. In Japan, there are quite a bit of actually scholarship that focus on how these people, went to Ishigakijima, and then of course after Japan was defeated, they're stuck in the Japanese side and they became Japanese. So they're Japanese of Taiwanese ancestry, right? So there's a sizable number of them, and they kind of dominated the local pineapple industry basically because they brought this settler knowledge from colonial Taiwan, which has connection to Hawaii. So you have this weird sort of a connection, right? In terms of like, if you focus on technology and expertise, originally Hawaii, Japanese immigrants in Hawaii brought that over with their body as migrants to Taiwan. And then Taiwanese actually took that idea and then practiced and so forth. I then took it to Ishigakijima, and then they dominated the sort of a pineapple industry there. Now, but after 1945, they became Japanese. So there are some studies on them in the post-war period. It's more kind of by the Japanese scholars who kind of adopt the Japan-centric sort of a kind of perspective to see like, oh, how these minority people, Taiwanese, turn into sort of a Japanese, blah, blah, right? But the way that I explain is a sort of a different narrative. So I'm actually thinking about maybe writing about this particular population with a focus on the pre-war period, which Japanese scholars usually don't really pay attention to. They are more interested in the post-war period when they became Japanese, right? In relation to all kind of Japanese racism and other things. That's their concern and agenda. But then, I can maybe write about this sort of a, strange career of settler colonialism, tying that the Hawaii, Taiwan, and then even Ishigakijima, and then focusing on Japanese immigrants, in a racial minority in Hawaii, becoming a kind of sort of colonial master in Taiwan as a result of remigration and then their expertise. Now the Taiwanese, these pineapple cannery folks, they are of course minority, colonized minority, and then suffer the consequence of being such in the context of consolidation. And then they decided to go to Ishigakijima, but then they could, not the colonial master, but then they could use their expertise to actually kind of dominate the local industry. But in this case, I think their colonized standing in the sort of a Japanese system still mattered because they could not become colonial masters, unlike those Hawaii folks, right? Then they adapted this language of imperial subject to kind of deal with this tension with the local I guess the Ishigakijima people. So that there's a difference there, where that I can talk about the different sort of a positionality issue between these Taiwanese who moved to Ishigakijima and then Japanese coming to Hawaii, right? Coming to Taiwan, right? Japanese control Taiwan. There's a differences there, but there are also similarities there. And then maybe, I can sort of talk about these interesting issues in this article I'm thinking of maybe writing someday, I guess. But anyway, so that's my answer to your question. So there are interesting after stories and then kind of sort of, side stories relating to this as well. My focus was not really the impact on colonized population, right? And, even though that was sort of a central sort of a kind of perspective, but because of my language ability or lack thereof, and also I'm not the expert in Taiwan history per se, so I did not and could not really focus on that kind of impact per se on Taiwanese people, right? Rather, I focused on what these Japanese settler colonists did and so forth, and mentioned a little bit of kind of snapshots or sort of a glimpse into the impact. But I hope that like a real expert on Taiwan history might be able to actually kind of rewrite, I guess, that historical narratives in the colonial period, maybe by adapting sort of a settler colonial kind of sort of a language or perspective. But I'm not the person who can do and should do, because I'm not the expert, and that's for your job, I guess. But anyway, so but if you see that any use of the kind of perspectives and then new narratives that I created, and then maybe you might want to actually do something similar in your own study and so forth, then I think that my contribution, but that's my contribution, I suppose. Okay. Anyway, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you. I think you already made great contribution to open up our perspective in analyzing what happened in Taiwan and what happened to Taiwan. I especially appreciate the idea of looking at all these individuals as agency in shaping and pushing the history to move forward. I think this very much reminds me of what Eric Hobsbawm talk about, the uncommon people. I mean, they are very critical decision and take action to change how history evolves. I would like to move on to the next question by Jack. Jack, please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, I can see you too.
Hi, Professor Zuma.
Yes.
I'm Jack Neubauer. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at NCCU. First, I wanted to thank you for such a fascinating talk. It's such an amazing story, and one I was totally ignorant of. And I think the way you conceptualize it is so interesting and so valuable for future studies as well. I wanted to sort of circle back to the beginning of your talk and ask about how or whether this sort of the idea of Japan's borderless empire may have shaped the way Japanese migrants either viewed or interacted with Chinese migrants or other East Asian migrants in spaces like Hawaii and California. To the extent they conceptualize themselves as settler colonists representing a pan-Asian empire with its own racial ideology, does that sort of import certain colonial relations into the way they deal with Chinese or other Asian migrants, or does the sort of context of being in a white-dominated U.S. imperial space with an anti-Asian racism that sort of flattens all East Asians into one group sort of prevent or limit or reshape the ways those sort of colonial relationships can be structured?
Great question, actually. So this is not that your question actually is related to one of the many sort of a kind of agendas I had in producing my book, which I actually didn't really touch on, which has to do with this concept of borderless empire and so forth. I mentioned, but really I didn't really define it, right? And I think that your question has to do with that aspect as well. That would require a different paper to give, so that's why I didn't really get into it. But I'm glad that you actually asked that question. So this is a tension between sovereign land and then foreign land, right? And also this has to do with the different positionality of migrants, as I kind of signaled, right? That if immigrants are in foreign country, especially then that means they are subject to the legal system. And then I guess racism, ethnocentrism of that host country, so to speak, right? And now in the U.S. case, they are subjected to that pre-existing anti-Asian sentiments and also the legal structure, starting with the anti-Chinese, got roots back into the anti-Chinese agitation in late 19th century and so forth, right? So then they are, their positionality in the U.S. context as Japanese immigrants are no different from Chinese, they're Orientals, right, subjected to the same legal system, right? But then, if that Japanese migrated to, say, Taiwan, they are colonial masters with all the privilege and power. Why? Because they are a member of the sovereign empire or nation political power, right, that controlled the land, right? So now these are the very important differences, and also that when I discussed that the question basically my definition of borderless empire has to grapple with this sort of a tension between these two sort of systems, right? And then what the Japanese immigrants thought about this situation. Now, so there was always tensions, but then also they could actually mix these things up, and then they had that kind of capacity to imagine and act on that imagination that somehow Japanese community in America was deeply connected and not much different from Japanese community in Taiwan. That was a kind of view that actually sustained this sort of idea this mobility in a way from Hawaii to Taiwan too, right? But at the same time, so the Japanese, sort of Okazaki guy, he didn't really see any huge difference in terms of what he was doing in Hawaii or in Taiwan. But then, in his idea, about himself and his kind of dedication to Japan's kind of expansion, national expansion, so forth, it can happen in Hawaii, it can happen in Taiwan, it didn't matter. They are all connected. Therefore, the Japanese community in Hawaii and the prosperity in Hawaii, Japanese community in Hawaii, is part of Japan's prosperity. In that way, he kind of envisioned a sort of a borderless empire, where that he could still maintain the same sense of connection to, Taiwan or the Japan itself or whatever other places, right? Now, but then there's also important distinction here too, which has to do with that his decision to move to Taiwan in a particular time, which illuminate that this sort of a conflict between the different political systems and sovereign powers, right? As migrant, he had to deal with that. If he remained in Hawaii, he's subjected to racism there. And then after 1924, it's kind of impossible to be independent anymore because there are all kind of laws and so forth against them. Then also 1923, I didn't mention, but the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court actually denied the naturalization rights to all Japanese, right? So then, so that was a very important decision that the Okazaki, or the time, I guess, timing was very important. He decided to say goodbye to Hawaii, that moment because of the situation, right? And then moved to Taiwan. So here, you see the two things going on at the same time. One, Okazaki didn't really see him doing anything different in Hawaii or Taiwan. He could just see that the Japanese community in Hawaii was no different from Japanese community in Taiwan in the context of Japan's global expansion and its global borderless empire, right? In that scheme. But at the same time, he made certain decision in terms of his migration, right? That has to do with this division between, foreign and then domestic, or Japan's imperial territory versus foreign country, right? So that's, I think that this is a theme that I continuously deal with in my book, okay? Now, going back to your question, in that, then the relationship to Chinese actually is very important here. Now, in relation to that, these migrants' perspective or their sort of self-consciousness and so forth, Chinese was always sort of a kind of counter or negative reference point, okay, in terms of their sense of who they are as frontiersmen or settlers or colonial and so forth, right? And then, because of the Chinese exclusion, basically. And then, U.S. was the first place that Japanese went, modern Japanese went as immigrants, even before that, colonial territories, right? 1880s, they're not even a colonial territory yet, right? So that's where that the, Japanese, actually, but also kind of, ideologically too, as a group had the experience of dealing with, say, sort of foreign racism or the sort of a kind of reaction to them as a settler or migrants, right? And so then they're treated like Chinese, basically, or they're conflated with Chinese, right? Of course, that about that how Japanese already had kind of developed that sense of superiority to Chinese and other Asians, like Fukuzawa's Datsuaron, right? Escape from Asia kind of ideas and so forth. So we are modern people. We might be Asians, but we are different from those Koreans or Chinese who failed to be modernized, right? In that way, we are, better than those people. But we are closer to white people or the Europeans in terms of our cultural capacity to be civilized, right? And that's the kind of idea they had already developed. Then that's the reason why some of these sort of early immigrants to California or Hawaii, thought that they could actually participate in this sort of epic global sort of a kind of phenomena, conquering the frontier and turning all the new world frontiers into civilization, right? White people are doing it. Anglo-Saxon, the best white people are doing it. We should be able to participate in that because we are good or the superior race as well, right? And that's the kind of concept they had. Now in California, first thing they encountered was that the conflation with Chinese. You can imagine that's like a terrible situation, right? So and then of course the folks in Japan learned all about this situation. And then of course the anti-Japanese sort of politics in California and Hawaii became a sort of an important factor in US-Japan relations, right, from the get-go, right? So that the folks in Japan already are also kind of exposed to this issue, even though they didn't migrate, right? So then conflation with Chinese is like a last thing they wanted to see, right? And so then this is my first book. My first book kind of deal with the Japanese immigrants and their relation to Imperial Japan and then also their relationship to the Chinese community and then white Americans and so forth. It's my first book in the American context. But this sort of the Japanese immigrants in America and also other places as well, all over the place, they always try to create some kind of difference or sort of engaged in the kind of sort of effort kind of collective community-wide effort to create the idea of distinction from Chinese immigrants surrounding them because of, the conflation, I suppose, right? So then that, I think, well, of course, that affected how the Japanese acted in other places, like Mexico, for example. Mexico had its own anti-Chinese, sentiments, and then also the state-sponsored sort of system and so forth. Japanese are always aware of that and insistent on the distinction from Chinese. This was done by Japanese community leaders, but also Japanese diplomats representing their interest as imperial subject, right? So then the diplomatic negotiation between Japan and Mexico, immigration issue was an important part of it, but that is always connected to the status of Japanese different from Chinese who had been already discriminated against in Mexico. And one of the reasons why Brazil became so important to Japanese is Brazil adopted the immigration policy where that Japanese and Chinese are separated. And that's the reason why there's no mass Chinese immigration to Brazil before World War II. Okay, after that the abolition of slavery in Brazil, Brazil needed that cheap labor basically for plantation economy, right? And just like the U.S. and so forth. So then the Brazil actually faced with this problem of who to import as immigrants. Labor, right? And then that's where the white sort of a kind of whitening sort of a kind of policy was sort of adopted. Brazil actually wanted to bring the Italians and Germans and then Portuguese and so forth instead of the Chinese. So Chinese are explicitly excluded. Influence coming from U.S. racial discourse and so forth as well. So it's kind of global circulation of racial knowledge and ideas here, right? But then of course Brazilians or the former Portuguese, I guess, they had their own racism too. So they wanted to actually whiten their nation. They had enough black slaves already, but we want to have more white people. That was the Brazil's sort of a basis of the Brazil's immigration policy after abolition of slavery, where there's preference given to those South, the Europeans, especially Italians and then Spaniards and then Germans and so forth. Now, what about Japanese? The Japanese are actually included into the category, kind of sort of an honorary white status in a way, okay? So the Japanese rejoiced it, of course, the government people and so forth, and they're explicitly separated from Chinese, and it kind of welcomed as a pseudo-white, civilized people, right? And that's the reason why later there would be state-sponsored, settler migration scheme agreed upon between the treaty between the U.S., Japan and Brazil, right? Later, right? So here again, you see that the Chinese question was sort of a very important background, right? And of course, that wherever the Japanese go, Southeast Asia, many Japanese went to outside of Japanese Empire, but then like a British Borneo, Northern Borneo, and then Dutch Indonesia and so forth. There are a lot of Japanese going there as well. Some are business people, some are workers and so forth. The community leaders, they're always concerned about the conflation with Chinese. There are a bunch of Chinese there. So, that's also how they engaged in their own race politics or ethnic identity formation and community formation there. Always try to distance from Chinese or create some kind of notion of difference. Usually the language of civilization was used, because you can't use that sort of a scientific kind of racial language to make distinction between Japanese and then Chinese, right? They're considered kind of same in the kind of Mongolian group. So then Japanese actually had to use more kind of culturalist language. I say culturalist language, especially idea of civilization, okay? Capacity to become modern and civilized, so much so that we could have this, empire of our own. Look at China, they failed, right? So you see that kind of sort of discourse all over the place in Japanese communities, inside empire or outside empire. So again, here, so this has to do with that. But then, this whole kind of idea of avoiding conflation with Chinese had to do with the deep, this U.S. legal system and then sovereign control, defining Chinese in one way and Japanese in similar way. but then Japanese are responding to it, but then kind of, and then spreading this discourse across the boundaries, right? So you see that this tension between sovereign extraterritorial land and then political systems, but then also confusion of sort of a kind of trans or kind of sort of overarching kind of discursive formation as well, right? Which all combined, they kind of both kind of influence the behavior and thinking of Japanese migrants wherever they went. So again, this is a roundabout way of addressing your excellent question, and also explain that the other issues as well that some other people might have wanted to ask. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate this. I think we'll make the most of our time. I would move on to the next question by Vincent. Vincent, please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually, thank you, Professor Azuma, for your presentation. I'm actually an alumnus of NCCU History Department, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Ohio State University. I think your talk is very fascinating, especially also some themes that sound still very relevant even today, like how an empire's racist policy provides resources for another empire's expansion, unfortunately. So I think what surprised me the most is that it actually worked. I mean, what I'm saying is that perhaps because I study modern China, Leiqing and Republican civilizing projects. So most cases I see is how either civilizing projects or technological transfer failed. So I was so surprised that it seems that the pineapple plantation at Laopi, like there seems to be some like real essence or technological know-how behind this Hawaiian remigrant. So my question is, first, I hope it's not too ahistorical or hypothetical, but how would you describe or like why this, if I may call it technological transfer, like why it was it very particular to this Hawaiian Japanese immigrant? What I'm saying is that if their methods of plantation was so effective and efficient, like was it ever become like more general, like a spread or transferred in with like a kind of global capitalism being brought to other places? Or was it so technical, so private to this businessman, Japanese business migrant, so that it had to come with this Hawaiian remigrant? Or like, what was it simply because the Japanese empire was so convenient for businessmen, so it had to happen in such an exploitive way, although global capitalism was no less exploitive. So so I just wonder, like, why this technological transfer happened to occur in this format. Thank you.
Great, excellent question. Thank you, and thank you for joining this from the other side of the globe, I guess. Well, let's see. Let me address this in 2 different ways. So first, technology issue. So I actually focused, since I'm a historian of migration, and I kind of use that the migration, or actually sort of migrants bringing ideas and technologies or the expertise, right? But the expertise and ideas and techniques can actually travel from one imperial sphere or one nation to another without the involvement of actual migrants or bodies, right? So, I think that more often than not, that's the case. Or you can have, say, international students like you might actually go back to Taiwan to teach, right? But then that knowledge you're acquiring in the US academia is something you can maybe contribute, use, right? To maybe make you look better than your competitors in job market, so to speak, right? You know what I'm saying, right? So, it could happen, it still does happen, right? In various ways. So sometimes you don't actually have to have bodies or sort of migrants. Like books can actually take care of it, right? Or yeah, the pineapple's case. No, this actually. What can I say? So yeah, for example, pineapple. Let's look at the transition from Japanese time to Taiwanese time, or sort of after defeat of Japanese Empire, right? Kuomintang came and then took over and so forth, right? And then that the pineapple industry, there was very noticeable disruption to the pineapple industry, sugar industry too, between Japanese time and then defeat, and then Kuomintang came, and then now that they're rebuilding the economy, right? It's a kind of smooth transition, more or less. Why? Well, because the Japanese time, the industry was controlled by Japanese, basically Japanese, right? But then by 1945, there are enough Taiwanese who have been working as a part of the system, right? Not the top, but the mid-level administrators, or even on the ground, right? Maybe just working under that, Japanese supervisors, but they are doing the job and they know what to do, right? And of course, that Taiwan had developed its own education system to produce experts, right? They had the agriculture experimental stations. Of course, most of the agriculture engineers are Japanese, but then there are some, Chinese, educated agricultural scientists and so forth. If you go to National Chongqing University at Taichung, they have the collection of the master's thesis, because that was agricultural school, right? And many of the master's theses during the Japanese time were actually, produced by Taiwanese students. They would be important part of the sort of agricultural technocracy, and also the industry as well, right? Of course, Japanese time, they are not the top. That's how hierarchical systems work. But when Japan lost and Japanese had to leave, those people just could slide into this top level, and they could control the industry based on the knowledge and expertise they had already acquired. And then that's the same system that had been running, right, under the same kind of sort of techniques and so forth, and they could just do it. And that, I think that's the reason why there was kind of not really noticeable disruptions, really, okay, in my opinion. And but that also, I think, means that technology and that sort of knowledge could be actually acquired in that kind of educational system based on books, learning the books and so forth, right? So I think that's another way. But then that also means the initial phase, there was a specific need for some expert, could be actually, say, Americans recruited to work in Japan, doesn't have to be Japanese immigrants. Say, if you look at the Hokkaido's colonization scheme, settler colonialism, modern Japanese history started with the colonization of Hokkaido, right, by Meiji government, okay? Now, and what the first thing that the Meiji government did in the 1870s was to recruit a couple of white American agricultural scientists. They became teachers, right? And then Japanese had this system of oyatoi gaikokujin, like a sort of a hired foreign expert. But that's sort of early phase when the domestic economic or educational system could not really produce the actual expert, right? Who actually had the hands-on experience and so forth. Same thing happened in Taiwan. I talked about this Otsuki Konosuke guy who was recruited by, the sugar company in Huari and then came over, right? Before him, the sugar company actually recruited a couple of Japanese educated or Japan educated agricultural scientists. They all failed. They knew enough about tropical agriculture from books, but then there's no tropical agriculture to even experiment on in Japan, right? So all they had was knowledge taken from books not on Hawaii, not Taiwan, it's Hawaii or the Jamaica, whatever, right? And they're actually doing the sugar plantation work or sugar cane cultivation in Hawaii. They all failed because the conditions are different. They're not so adaptive. Adaptive settler colonialism, that's a concept I actually use in my book. So in that level, but then this Otsuki guy was the last resort by this company he had reputation like Okazaki in the pineapple. So in his case, he was known as a kind of, he knows how to do the sugar cane cultivation, okay? So then recruited him and brought him over. He was already 60 years old, but he was the last resort. And he had some problem initially because Hawaii, Taiwan different, but then he had adaptability because of his experience back. So then he could sort of he became successful, right? Now, but by 1920 or so, I say that the local educational system in Taiwan could actually produce the expert with the experience and so forth. So then people like him less and less important. So so in the sugar industry, after 1920 or so, there would be less and less Hawaii folks coming to Taiwan. But pineapple, that's a little time lag and so forth, right? Anyway, so that, I don't know, I'm kind of answering question in these ways. But then the reliance on Hawaii also had to do with that what the Hawaii's sugar, pineapple industry did in response to the rise of the Japan's or the interest in the Japan's interest in pineapple industry, trade secret, right? From their standpoint, Hawaii. So they actually tried to kind of shut down the door, basically, okay? And to Japanese, any Japanese visiting Hawaii, I'm not gonna teach you anything about the Hawaii situation and so forth. The industry started to adopt that the kind of kind of policy, and then you kind of had to rely on this sort of this Japanese, right? White people wouldn't probably tell you what to do because the industry actually had this policy, right? But the Japanese immigrants, they don't care. They are nationalists, right? They're dedicated to homeland expansion, right? Prosperity, right? Again, their sort of mentality or self-identity as from, kind of still part of Japanese expansionism or sort of, all that overseas expansion and so forth. Right? So those people would tell you what to do despite or because of this kind of sort of policies, right? That Hawaii's industry adopted, right? So I think that was also very important kind of sort of a factor in this kind of reliance on sort of Japanese immigrants in Hawaii, okay? And then, just one little thing, not directly relating to your point, but then it is important to acknowledge that the Japanese, I know that scholars of Taiwan history knows, or colonial Taiwan knows it, but Japanese actually took advantage of the Qin system, right? Especially like, dealing with the Aboriginal population. Japanese colonizers did not invent the new way. They actually kind of built upon the existing Qin mechanism, right? Or separation and so forth, right? So, of course, not exactly the same, but then they had their own spins to put on the Qin system. But then I think it's important to look at that connection as well, okay? But then, this is where this Japanese kind of sort of their sense of relationship to Chinese past come into the picture, which I addressed too, right? They did not want to explicitly say that we are actually using Chinese system or sort of taking advantage of it. That's like a kind of, undermining their sense of difference from Chinese, right? So then, there's a tension there, but then definitely I think there was the kind of, attempt to use that pre-existing Qin system, right? So, but then, anyway, but that's a different kind of sort of influences coming from the foreign sources. But I say it's not just US. Of course, I didn't talk about the Singapore or Malay connection or even Dutch connection. Those are very important reference points as well. Okay. In other aspects of the colonial development and so forth, I say more probably that kind of Malay or sort of Nanyang connection would be more important or reference point for Taiwanese. The Hawaii was, in this case it was important, but other cases no, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And also another influence I have to emphasize is Qin dynasty influence as well. So again, I hope I addressed some of your questions. Anyway, so that's my answer to your questions.
Thank you for the great question, and thank you for very inspiring answers to these questions. We are already 3 minutes beyond our scheduled talk. So I would like to conclude the formal talk here by thanking, first of all of you in the audience to participate in this very special virtual online talk. And I would also like to thank the staff at the Department of History for helping us to set up and making this a very smooth operation. And last but not least, I would like to thank Professor Azuma again, not just by giving us this talk today, but spending the past 3 months with us. We still have a couple of weeks left, and we are hoping that by the time you leave Taiwan, we'll still be able to get together and have more scholarly exchange and also fun activities, hopefully, by the time you leave Taiwan. So thank you again for taking part in this virtual talk. I think we can end the recording now, but I would like to, I think we still have a couple minutes left in our Google Meet setup. So for those of you who are interested in staying for a more informal chat, we would very much like to ask you to have you.